And to get started with, there are three environment developers are typically going to be deploying to. I mean, some places are two, but let's start with the three first. There is the development environment, the staging environment, and the production environment. The dev branch, the staging branch, and the production branch, or the dev environment, staging environment, and the production environment. The dev environment is where developers write their code in, they test the application, they it might be a remote branch, so they push it there. But this just belongs to the developers, right? As a PM, you're most likely not interacting with this environment at all. It's just for the developers. The staging environment is where a developer pushes the code and deploys the code to for it to be reviewed by the product manager, the quality assurance tester, the QA tester, whoever is in charge, the tech leads, before the pull request is approved and merged into production, right? So this is where, as a product manager, you'll be seeing the code base that has not been merged to review it and give your feedback. And the production environment is where, the part your users have access to, obviously, production. So that's what the part your users are actually interacting with. Now, for some companies, there are only two environments, the staging and the production. Some companies merge the dev and staging together, depending on your processes or your style or the way you do things. So if your company has two environments, production and dev/staging, then as a PM, you would have access to dev/staging, or you must have access to dev/staging and to the production environment, right? You have access to those two. So for the, I would walk you through how to deploy to each of these. Usually the dev, staging, and production are an exact replica of themselves. The similar code base, especially staging and production, exact replica of themselves. The only thing that really changes are the environment variables. So what's an environment variable? An environment variable are data or items or variables. I remember we talked about variables, usually strings or Boolean, that are secrets or that changes across the different deployment location, right? So your access link, your secrets, it could be anything, right? But these are the things that they are different for production, staging, and dev environment. So that, you don't want to be testing on staging with the actual production database. It's very dangerous. That should never be done. You also don't want to be testing on staging with actual user records or be testing on staging with an actual existing back account. So on staging, you're going to, the developers or as a PM, you're going to create an environment around that allows you to simulate a production environment without actual consequence of having a production environment. So most of the Postman we talked about, most of it is going to be interacting on staging, because if you run Postman on production, you can to debug an issue or to test how things are. But if you do a lot of Postman requests on production, you could have actual consequence on user records. So you probably don't want to be doing that. You want to be doing it on staging, where you can change as many things as possible without any consequence. So let's look at some of the different tools that developers deploy to. There is GitHub, Pages, there is Netlify, there's Heroku, Host, GoDaddy, Namecheap, DigitalOcean. There are a lot of these tools that we could be deploying our applications to. I'll just walk you through how to deploy to some of them. You don't have to care too deeply about the code, just get the idea of how it works. So that when you're talking to your developer friends, when you're in an interview, it actually makes sense for you to it actually makes a lot of sense for you. You can actually explain this concept quite easy. Before we go into GitHub, looking at how to deploy to GitHub, for example, if you have a static website, you can deploy that easily to GitHub Pages because of nothing changes. The static website is a website that doesn't really connect to a database per se, doesn't do a lot of dynamic data. It's just an HTML page. We'll be deploying a static page ourselves right now. So that's a static website. And it's a simple HTML page, a picture, an image, a file. Nothing really changes. They're not dynamic. These are static pages. A dynamic page, a dynamic website, a dynamic application requires it to run in an environment that can run, depending on the programming language, that can accommodate the programming language itself. So for example, you have a Node.js environment, a PHP script. This requires dynamic, an environment that can run the PHP script. Unlike a static page that the browser just makes a request to the backend or to the wherever you deploy to, receive the file, the HTML file or the CSS file, and displays the content. The browser can now display the JavaScript. For static applications, for dynamic applications rather, when the front end makes a request to where the application was deployed to, some processing has to be done to generate a user data or to do some magic behind the scene, right? And for the responses returned. Right, so if you have some like WordPress application, you might want to consider using some platforms like Google Host, GoDaddy, Namecheap. It also works for PHP applications. If you have a Node.js application, a Python application, you might be considering Heroku, Netlify, or Dockerized application. You might be considering Heroku or Netlify or AWS, right? For a start, if you're just starting out, you probably want to use some of the easier to use platforms like Heroku, Netlify, GoDaddy, Google, depending on what you're deploying, because they're relatively easier to use and they are relatively cheaper to start with. But as your organization starts to scale, you start to realize that this service, these providers might not be suitable for your company. So you want to migrate to a much more solid system like AWS, Google Cloud Compute, Microsoft Azure, some cloud providers, or your own local servers, right? So for a start, you start with Heroku, Netlify. Your developers can spin up applications quite easily. And as your company scales, you move to much more complex systems that require much more technical experience from the developers to work with. So let's look at how to deploy to GitHub.